So Formula 1 has seen several types of engine in use over the years. Naturally aspirated, turbo hybrid, supercharged, and the one that is often used as the epitome of excess during the 80s was the turbos. Cars that had a ridiculous amount of power for what they were. Cars that were nowhere near as safe as they are today, and having more power than they do now. Well, that's not strictly the case, and that's something we'll get to in a bit. The Ford DFV had been F1's go-to engine for about 10 years due to its cost and off-the-shelf nature, meaning anybody could just buy an engine and go racing if they needed to, not having to rely on building one in-house or sourcing one from another team. But one thing in the rules that I didn't realise existed for the 1967 season is that teams could either run a 3-litre naturally aspirated engine, or they could run a 1.5-litre forced injection engine. Basically a turbocharged one. But it took another 10 years for somebody to have a crack, because the DFV had proven so reliable and also being so good that teams would be stupid to not have a DFV. It was cheaper to run a DFV and be competitive than spend loads on an injected engine and be off the pace and wasting a ton of cash. But eventually, turbos entered the sport. But it wasn't an opening of the floodgates because Renault was the only team to use them. The problem was, while these engines had the power of a 3.5-litre engine in something over half the engine displacement, they were thirsty, heavy, and unreliable. Jean-Pierre Jabouille was the first man to drive a turbocharged car in the late 1970s, and it was madly unreliable, not finishing a single race it contested in 1977, and it taking until the US Grand Prix the following year to score some points, a fourth at Watkins Glen. Now it has to be said that in 1977 that car only did 5 races. It had a non-qualifying in Canada and then DNF'd in the rest of them, but then did all but the Argentine and Brazilian Grand Prix in 1978, with only 4 finishes in that year. The car was known as the Yellow Teapot because it was ugly and often blew up in a plume of white smoke, but when the car did work, it worked pretty well, and it especially worked well at places like the Österreich Ring, Kyalami and places like that because the DFV and the other naturally aspirated engines would lose something around 20% of their overall power at those higher altitudes. Beginning in the 1980s, turbos started to become a little more common, and even Ferrari had a go at making one. Williams and Alan Jones would win the title in a naturally aspirated car in 1980, but with the way turbos were developing, the writing was on the wall for engines like the DFV, which over time only started to be supplied to the teams that couldn't afford new expensive turbos such as Tyrrell. Brabham team owner Bernie Ecclestone persuaded BMW, the suppliers of the team's engines, to design an inline-4 turbo engine, while others went for a V6 configuration, with Alfa attempting a V8 turbocharged engine. Now it has to be said here that the BMW engine was a single turbo and the V configuration engines were all twin turbos. By 1983, ground effect was gone because of the deaths of Gilles Villeneuve at Zolder and the ending of Didier Pironi's career at Hockenheim. By this time, the turbos were starting to get even more powerful, and with ground effect gone, the cars looked like they were driving on ice. Turbochargers work by essentially shoving more air into the engine for the suck, squeeze, bang, blow internal combustion cycle. More oxygen equals a bigger bang, and it also allows for a more consistent bang. In this era, what happened is the exhaust gases spun up the turbine that sucked more air in and then forced it into the engine, which created more power. Now as an aside, turbocharging wasn't new. And when I say it wasn't new, what I mean is that when it came to cars, it was new, but it had actually been done before. Planes like the Spitfire, the Hurricane and the like during the Second World War were supercharged to allow them to perform at high altitudes. The bombers of the time would have used them as well to be able to fly over the anti-aircraft artillery on the ground and make it harder for them to get shot down. So with 0 bar of boost, an engine is running naturally aspirated, like Nico Rosberg's engine was during the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix of 2014 when his hybrid system all packed in and he was much slower than everybody else. Now 1 bar is basically atmospheric pressure at sea level, so there's just that going through the engine to make the internal combustion cycle happen. With 1 bar of boost, it now has 2 atmospheric pressures at sea level going through, which effectively doubles the displacement. So your 1.5 litre engine is now a 3 litre engine, although power output isn't doubled or increased by the same scale. That engine that Renault brought in 1977 only had about 500 horsepower, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot, but this was just the beginning. And when Jabouille finally had a race where his engine didn't blow up and he won the race, it opened the floodgates. Porsche, Honda, BMW and even Ferrari started looking at turbochargers seriously, because up until this point, Renault and their turbochargers were seen as a joke. When that Renault worked, it was unstoppable, and in 1982 Brabham began using the BMW M12 inline 4 with the DFV at some select races. With no boost, the engine put out a measly 300 horsepower. It did have a few advantages though over the Ferrari and Renault turbos in that it only had one turbocharger versus two on the others, and it also had two fewer cylinders, making it lighter. The whole thing weighed about 170 kilos or 375 pounds. It meant that overall the Brabham was a smaller car and lighter as well, meaning the power to weight was, well, better. Brabham also pioneered in-race refueling, but this was banned for 1984 due to the FIA wanting to keep the cars in check as they could see the power output increasing too much for them to keep up in terms of the regulations. By the end of 1983, it's rumoured that the BMW was able to put out 900 horsepower in full party mode, and the FIA installed a limit of 220 litres of fuel in the tank to try and make the teams and drivers ration their fuel to survive to the end of a Grand Prix, or at least force the engine manufacturers to focus on efficiency over power. But was that going to stop these turbos? Was it ever? In 1984, the power output increased again. It's rumoured that the BMW was able to put out 1,000 horsepower at 11,000 RPM, which is a lot for the era that we're talking about. Now, it's also rumoured that every 0.1 of a bar of boost was worth about 20 horsepower, and at the Italian Grand Prix that year, Gerhard Berger set what was then a straight line speed record for an F1 car. 219 miles an hour, which is 352 kilometers for you metrics. While they had limited the amount of fuel you can carry in the tank, the FIA had still allowed unrestricted boost. The teams could ram as much air through that engine not so much as they wanted, but as much as they could. We've added that extra element of competition here. They developed these special qualifying engines that had the wastegates welded shut and other things done to the engines for max power. Unlike with max power, the drivers strapped themselves in and felt the G's as this car went off like a top fuel dragster. The cars became the world's fastest hand grenades, basically because they just kept blowing up the more power they tried to ram through these engines and the gearboxes that they built to handle these engines. The cars were good for 1 or 2 laps on super sticky qualifying tyres, and engine and tyres were then just lobbed in the bin. But BMW was on the way out of the sport for the end of 1986 and decided they were going to have one last hurrah when it came to mental engine performance. Or maybe that's what the M actually stands for in M Sport. Mental. Bear in mind that in 1980, 500 horsepower was considered peak engineering. We're now in 1986, 6 years later, and engine power had been making super huge leaps in performance year on year, and still the FIA allowed unrestricted boost in qualifying and in the race. But they did reduce the fuel cap to 195 litres to try and forcibly get them to turn the engines down and focus more on economy than ever before. The Renault engine in the back of the 1986 Lotus 98T was running 900 horses in race spec, and the qualifying performance had reached a point where the FIA could no longer allow this to continue, as the power output is alleged to have been 1,300 horsepower from the BMW. Now there is a little bit of an aside here once again, because every 5 years or so the number produced by that BMW engine seems to gain another 100 horsepower. There are websites, TV shows and F1 YouTubers that will say that the cars produce 900 horsepower stock. Top Gear said that the MP44 was the last of the 1000 horsepower monsters when by 1988 the power was reined in so much it couldn't produce that amount of power. So over the years that 900 has become 1000, then 1100. Then 1200. So next year expect videos on this subject to be claiming 1500 horsepower from these ticking time bombs. Ridgeway Racing Engines puts the estimated power band of that BMW engine to be 300 horsepower with no boost and 1300 on its full party mode, with the amount of actual boost being estimated to have peaked in 1986 at around 5.5 bar, which is equal to about 80 psi or so for any Americans watching. Now, driving those cars at that time must have been near on impossible because of one little extra thing that happens when you add a turbocharger to an engine. Turbo lag. These days, turbos can be electronically spooled up, but in these days they were spooled up using the exhaust gases. So what would happen is the gases would start spooling the turbo up, and then about a second or so later you'd have this massive dump of power as the air finally rushes through. A bit like a trickle of water coming through a small hole and then busting the wall down in some sort of cartoon. This is how the whole Senna throttle blip thing began, because Senna would be nudging the throttle in the corners to try and keep the turbo spooled up as much as possible, so he had all the power needed on the exit with no lag, no boost, no wheel spin and all that stuff, while I'm assuming the other drivers just knew when the power would come over time. But by the end of the 1986 season, the FIA had seen enough, so for 1987 turbos were capped to 4 bar maximum across a whole race weekend, with that number capped to reduce the speeds and power, and then they reduced it to 2.5 bar for 1988, which would be the final year of the turbo engines. But while safety and power levels were a concern, there was also a concern that costs were becoming too much for the teams to justify the spending. Renault had spent a lot of money to not win the championship, being beaten by the customer Lotus team in 1986, and Alfa Romeo also left after having a pointless season. While the turbo era at its peak had BMW, Porsche, Renault and Honda, by the start of the 1988 season, only Honda remained. Ferrari excluded, obviously. The FIA allowed naturally aspirated engines once again for 1987, and many of the back-of-the-grid teams went back to the tried and tested Ford V8, with even more joining them in 1988. Then in 2014, the turbos returned, bringing forth the turbo hybrid era, where power has since reached the 4-figure output from 35 years ago or so, but the days of 1300 horsepower monsters returning are probably a while away yet. If at all. So then, a look at the madness that was the turbo engines of the 1980s. If you've learned something new here today, then do give the video a like so the algorithm can do algorithmy things, and also get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything I do here. Massive thanks as ever to the kind folk over at Patreon for the support, and if you want to help contribute to the image buying fund, then you can help out through the link to Patreon in the description, or the super thanks button if you just want to do a one-off. And there's also links in the description to Discord and my socials if you want to do that sort of thing too. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.